This is a Bergen Film Club podcast.
Like an old movie removed from the frame, I am floating and looking for someone to blame. Won't you project me on the walls of your heart? I'm waiting for the real thing to start.
Hello, and welcome to The Real Thing. I'm your host, Joe Lawrence, and here we are, episode 2. Let's go! I'm very excited to be here again doing this podcast. For those of you joining from last episode, so happy to have you back. For those of you just joining, also very glad that you're here. Strange for you to start on this second episode, but nonetheless, I'm glad to have you. This podcast is an extension of Bergen Film Club, which is an independent cinema at the heart of Bergen, Norway. The film club's main goal is giving a voice to those who deserve it, revealing insights into unknown cultures, and showing awesome movies. In this podcast, I talk about the films included in the film club's extensive program of films, and this episode, we got a doozy of a film. I am very looking forward to it. Today, we're talking about horror films, which I am buzzed about because I love horror films. I'm a very big fan of all of them, the good and the bad. Show me any of them, I'll probably like it. But I don't want to deter you. I know that it's a scary thing, but nothing scary is going to happen today. This is a safe space. Just two guys talking about blood, guts, gore, killing, all of that good stuff. We have a really good guest today, which I'm excited about. We had a really great conversation about gore and, like I said, wet blood and the use of that in horror films and whether it's all worth it. So definitely I'm excited for you guys to hear that. I suppose it was a really good interview. You see, what I'm doing now is hyping up my own podcast and something that is literally going to happen in 10 minutes, because on The Real Thing, we're all about instant gratification, and I can't wait for you to listen to this amazing episode that we put together. But first, how about some recommendations? So to start off with a podcast recommendation, I'm recommending This Podcast Will Kill You from Exactly Right Media. This podcast focuses on one disease, illness, syndrome, virus, one per episode, and the history, the biology, and its current status is described by its hosts, Erin Armin Updike and Erin Welsh, who are two disease ecologist PhDs. I love this podcast. It is so well researched. The structure, like I mentioned, history, biology, and current status, it's just so good. It's so great to listen to because it's so well researched, and the Erins know exactly what they're talking about. It's just so fantastic, and it's a really great way to learn about all of these diseases that are in the world and maybe get an insight into it. And it's just so fantastic because you basically learn how scared of certain diseases you should really be. They did a fantastic coverage of COVID-19 during the heat of the pandemic, and the American government actually selected that season of the podcast to help spread real information to the American public, which is just so awesome, and I really can't recommend this podcast enough. It is very, very good. So that was This Podcast Will Kill You on Exactly Right Media, on just wherever you get your podcasts. They just began their 6th season, and so far they've covered RSV and epilepsy, and I think that they're covering vitamin D deficiencies and a lot of more good stuff, so really check that out. That's one of my favorite podcasts. Now, a little left field recommendation. I'm reading a book. Crazy. I'm reading The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. I believe this is part of a 3-part trilogy about the cannibal Hannibal Lecter. I'm really, really enjoying this book. I I'm not gonna lie, I struggle with books. However much I hate to say it, my attention span is just getting worse as I get older. It's the Gen Z curse for sure. But this book is keeping me hooked for sure. The pacing is great. The characters are cool. Yeah, specifically for a horror episode, there's a lot of gruesome moments. Really cool female lead character, Clarice. Um, yeah, and I mean it's such an iconic thing. Silence of the Lambs, obviously, and but I've actually never seen the movie, so it's all new to me, and I'm enjoying it for the first time. So definitely check it out, film or the book, either way. But I guess that's what I'm recommending there. It's good. It's an exciting read for sure. Now, lastly, for a movie recommendation, Bergen Film Club showed a Brian De Palma double bill a couple weeks ago, and I'm recommending one of those films, and I know that those in Bergen Film Club are going to think this is very controversial, but I am recommending Brian De Palma's 2002 classic Femme Fatale. I thought that this movie was just so crazy, and it was kind of bad, but I just had no idea what was going to happen. The story was just so left field, and it was kind of plot twist after plot twist after plot twist that I couldn't help but enjoy it. It was kind of campy. It was exciting. There was some good action, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I don't understand why so many people hated on it at the time because I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. The only downside I would say to that film is that there are large parts of the film which are in French and there was no subtitles. So I feel like that might make it a little bit difficult if you don't speak French. But if you just want like a kind of sexy thriller crime Brian De Palma classic movie, then I really recommend Femme Fatale. I have seen Carrie, which is one of his other films, and that's obviously such an iconic, amazing movie. And Scarface and The Untouchables. But if you just want some fun, then I recommend Femme Fatale. And Antonio Banderas is in it, and this was the first role that I have ever seen him in as a real person. I've only ever seen him act in Shrek and Puss in Boots, so it was exciting to see him as a real person. So that's nice. Now for some Bergen Film Club updates, some news. We just had our folk horror film festival, which was a big success. It was very cool to have some people come out and see some spooky folk horror films. The one that really stood out the most to me was The Blood on Satan's Claw, the 1971 British supernatural horror film. I thought that film, unironically, was actually really scary, and not a lot of people found it scary. So I don't know what deep-seated trauma I have that I am not aware of that made it so scary, but it was definitely good. We also showed The Craft, which is going to be an episode on the podcast in a couple episodes' time. So definitely keep an eye out for that. That is such a cool movie, and I'm really excited to get to talk about it. This week, we are showing Polytechnique, which is a Denis Villeneuve movie, which is a dramatization of the Montreal massacre in 1989. And after that, we are showing Loves of a Blonde, which is a 1965 Czech comedy drama movie following a girl who's desperate for love, who will do anything to get it. So if you're in Bergen, definitely come and check those out. Polytechnique is on Wednesday and Loves of a Blonde is on Sunday. Now, let's just jump into the episode. Today, we are talking about Phil Tippett's 2021 movie, Mad God. So today we are talking about the 2021 film Mad God. This film, in a word, visceral. It is definitely an interesting watch. and it's kind of difficult to know where to start when describing it. So I think that we have to go a little bit back, 30 years back to be precise, to what will eventually bring us to this film, Mad God. So the film is directed, written, and produced by Phil Tippett, who is a revolutionary special effects artist. He is known for his work on the Star Wars trilogy, Jurassic Park, RoboCop, and basically any film that had any sort of CGI between 1985 and 2010. I would say those were sort of his main years. He worked on Piranha, he did the Wolves in the Twilight series, but obviously he didn't do it alone. He founded Tippett Studio in 1984 alongside his wife, Jules Roman, who's the president of the company and serves as executive producer for a lot of his work. It was a visual effects company specializing in CGI for films and TV. They worked on The Mandalorian, all of the Star Wars movies, RoboCop, which I think I mentioned, and Mad God. So like I said, we had to go 30 years into the past to begin with this process of Mad God, because the project begun in 1987. He began producing dozens of environments and hundreds of puppets for the projects, filling notebook after notebook with thousands of detailed sketches and storyboards. But due to the rise of his studio and his work on films like Jurassic Park, the project was eventually dropped. Decades after the success of Tippett Studio forced the production into stasis, a group of animators at the studio came upon these boxes full of these shelled props and puppets. Then a small group began volunteering their weekends to Mad God, and before long it had snowballed into a crew of more than 60 artists, most volunteering. A wildly successful Kickstarter campaign provided funding for the materials and the equipment, and this is how we came to have Mad God. In the upcoming conversation that I had with the guest, I include some quotes from Phil Tippett that sort of give a more of an insight into the process of making this film and the inner workings of Phil Tippett's brain. But basically, he was just cooking this idea in his brain all this time, even though it sort of got shelved, and in his head it was kind of a thing that was a shame to put to one side, but it was put to one side. He was still conceptually thinking of all the things that he wanted to put into the film. And what exactly did Phil Tippett put into this movie? He put a lot into it. He put a lot of blood. He put a lot of boobs and balls, poop, piss, vomit, people getting electrocuted and melted down, and that being eaten by someone else. It is a really intense movie to watch for sure. It has no real or traditional plot, but is more focused on the certain characters that we follow across the whole movie. So it's more character driven, focused on a style or an experience rather than being narrative driven. I would say that with watching this, you don't really need any more information than I've given you right now. It's good to just go in, relax as much as you can, and see this hellish Milton-esque journey that Phil Tippett takes you on. Ostensibly, it tells the story of a lone assassin's journey into a hellish underworld to detonate a bomb. It's told with a blend of stop-motion animation and surreal live-action elements. It uses minimal dialogue to tell its story and relies instead on these visceral mix of sight and sounds. It is kind of gross, but when you see if you can acknowledge the amount of work and precision that went into this movie, it is it's a feat of cinema, really. Phil and his team have done an amazing job with this film, and if anything, it's just impressive to watch, honestly. Just out of pure respect for this man showing the best of his skills to the max in what is Mad God. It was released on the horror streaming service Shudder, and it was actually Shudder's biggest film premiere ever. The budget of this film was $150,000 US, and the box office made $325,000. So it went way and above its box office. So it's definitely not for everyone. I can see that, but it's an experience for sure, and it's a movie that you won't forget. I think that at least everyone should see at least once. Now for the exciting part, I sat down with Bendik Vigsnes, who is one of the board members at our very own Bergen Film Club. He is the applications manager, and he is horror obsessed, so I couldn't think of anyone better to sit down with and talk Mad God with. One more thing before the interview gets started. We are a little bit of a work in progress here at The Real Thing, and me and Bendik had to share one microphone, so I'm sorry if the audio is a little strange. It isn't bad, but just if you were wondering what's going on. Hi, Bendik.
Hello, Joe. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for being on this episode.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Okay, let's just get started. We're talking about Mad God. So, Bendik, put it simply, what do you like about this film?
Well, what's not to like about it? If you're into practical effects, and the craftsmanship that goes into making practical effects, this is just a love letter to that type of filmmaking. And it's directed by Phil Tippett, who was a master in special effects. He did RoboCop, he did Jurassic Park. Mm-hmm. He's been in the game for a long time, and he's been making this for a long time. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how long he's been making it, but like 30 years, probably. Yeah, 30 years. 30 years in the making. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't heard about it until someone showed me a trailer last year when we were discussing putting it on the program for the film club. And it just looked insane. And when I finally did watch it, because we didn't put it on a program, but I managed to scurry it up through other means, and I watched it, and I thought it was brilliant. And it is one of those films that's very light on story. There's a lot going on visually, and I'm sure if you're one of those brainy film watchers, you can analyze almost every scene and deduct some kind of meaning. Mm-hmm. For me, it's mostly just a descent into madness or descent into hell. He just goes deeper. The main character, at least the one we follow at the start, he just goes deeper and deeper into depravity, deeper and deeper into this mysterious world filled with strange creatures and crazy doctors. And it is very much a film about a mood. It's a film that evokes a certain feeling in you, a feeling of dread. But at the same time, you get, especially if you're into, like I said, practical effects, you get really smitten by how much artistry on the screen. I mean, he handcrafted all these things. I mean, he had help, of course. He used people to help him. He didn't make it all by himself, but it's just stunning how much love, energy, and patience has gone into creating the creatures on display. It's incredible. And it's unfortunately, it's a dying art. I'm sure we'll talk about that too, how that type of filmmaking is slowly dying, even though I do feel we have kind of resurgence when it comes to practical effects in movies. There certainly isn't as much of it as it was when Phil Tippett was at his heyday, for instance. But no, I just love the film. I couldn't tell you why. And certainly it's a long watch. It's barely 90 minutes. Yeah. But when I watched it again, when we showed it in BFK, I remember thinking, man, these are some long 90 minutes.
Yeah, it definitely feels long. At this point, me and Bendik started to talk about what we thought drove Phil Tippett to make a movie like this. This film has such striking, vulgar images that we thought that this inspiration must come from somewhere. Our researchers, Ingrid and Momina, found that Phil Tippett is a self-described misanthropic person. Misanthropic meaning showing a dislike of other people, unsociable, not liking the world. We then found a quote that I feel like really highlights what he thinks he is like as a person, but definitely what brought him to create these visuals that are in this film. Quote, I really don't think that there's much hope for mankind at all from what I have observed. There's no way that Mad God could not be some reflection of this era. I follow the news very avidly, and I don't think that there's any way that you cannot be affected by that. It enters into your worldview and it's like breathing air. There's nothing that you can do about it. There's a lot that I would like to not remember, but all that stuff gets relegated to the unconscious, and that is where it cooks. And so that was pretty much the process for Mad God. If you were to ask me what Mad God is about, I say that it's about scale, process, and time. That was kind of my canvas that I was working with for this film. End quote. That quote alone really gives a whole new perspective for the film, at least for me. The horror and the despair that you feel from watching these visuals of a world on fire where there's despair and tragedy all around, it's actually a personification for these feelings that Phil is having about society and the way that the world is moving forward today.
Well, you can kind of feel his misanthropy and dark worldview in the film. Like, not only does this look like a world that's could be ours if things went really to shit and it took a few hundred years, but also the fact that every cute creature that shows up, and that's not many, there are only a handful of cute creatures, and they all get horribly killed at some point in the film. So it says something about how he is, I guess. And it's weird because he worked on Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
He's supposed to be a nice guy.
Yeah. Just mentioning Jurassic Park there. Obviously, I would have mentioned before, but you just mentioned now that it took him like 30 years to make this film. But one of the reasons why he sort of gave up the concept of it initially was when he was working on Jurassic Park. Obviously, there's like revolutionary CGI in that film. He, at the time, so I guess that was like 1980s.
93. Jurassic Park came out 93. In 93.
And he said that he was sort of realizing that there's not like a place for stop motion anymore. Whilst he was doing this like revolutionary work, which I guess, I mean, it's good for him that he got to work on Jurassic Park, but also sad that he felt like he had to give up his vision in a way that stop motion was a dying art.
They started out with stop motion, I think. I'm kind of speaking from memory now, from from a making of Jurassic Park documentary I watched, but they did start out with stop motion as before they realized that okay, no, this looks too fake. We have to go for computer. And I think Jurassic Park is like the perfect example of how CGI and practical effects can be welded together in a kind of fusion where it works. I think those effects still holds up, and it certainly wouldn't have looked as good if they used stop motion. It just wouldn't, because you can love stop motion, but it has that kind of fake quality to it.
Actually, I have a very good quote from film critic Roger Ebert, who I think you like. I don't know.
I like him.
Yeah, he said, computer graphics look real but feel fake, and stop motion looks fake but feels real. Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine Mad God with CGI?
Yeah.
It wouldn't have had the impact at all. It would just be some weird animation movie. It wouldn't have made an impact. The whole reason that movie works is the practical effects and the stop motion. Because like Roger Ebert said, stop motion, it means the effect is actually there. It's not just a green ball on a broom that someone is shoving in front of the face of the actor so he'll have something to look at. It's actually a thing that they made, which will always look better than CGI. I don't care if it's Avatar, the new Avatar, which had great CGI. It still is not as good, in my opinion, as the shark in Jaws, for instance. The one thing I don't like about the film is when the humans show up.
Okay.
That takes me out of the film when we have actors. It doesn't work as well for me, and I think that whenever fortunately there's not that many of those scenes, but whenever they happen, I feel like, let's get back to the stop motion and the dolls. It's much cooler.
As the film goes on, I feel like the large scaleness of it sort of diminishes, but I think that is probably directly proportional to his mental psyche. So it was probably easier to have human people in the film at that point than laboriously spending hours and hours and hours working on something that you are growing to hate.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, can you imagine working in this thing on and off for 30 years? It's
Yeah.
there's a level of dedication there that I can't fathom.
It's definitely something within this art form that I feel like a lot of people say that people are dedicated to it, but in a way I feel like it's obsession.
It is.
Yeah.
It's obsession, but it's obsession in a good kind of way. It's the obsession that creates cool art.
Yeah.
And like you were mentioning, Paranorman and Coraline, and these things, they are coming back. Like we just Guillermo del Toro just released his Pinocchio movie,
That's
which is
right.
also done purely practical. It seems like we're coming back around.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's always Hollywood is going to go crazy with its CGI for a while. After Jurassic Park, there was a period where, especially Spielberg and his friends, they were like obsessed with CGI. They thought everything would be better with CGI. I mean, George Lucas famously maligned. He killed his Star Wars movies by going back and adding all those stupid effects.
Sure.
Didn't make them look cooler, but he thought so.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while there was a big over reliance on CGI, and now luckily there seemed to be some sort of a turn. Even in the new Jurassic Park movie, Jurassic World Dominion, which was a pretty lousy film, but there was a lot more animatronic and practical effects work in that film than in the first Jurassic World.
So while discussing what are great examples of practical effects, we took a slight detour to talk about the work of Rob Bottin in John Carpenter's 1982 The Thing. Rob Bottin is an American special makeup effects creator. He's best known for his work in Basic Instinct, The Fog, The Thing, Seven, Fight Club, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He is hugely respected in his field of prosthetic makeup, even being described in 2013 as a special effects genius. He's been nominated for an Oscar, and he won a Special Achievement Academy Award in 1991 for his work. However, what we were talking about here is his work on The Thing related to this idea of obsessive work within practical effects. It is said that whilst working on The Thing, he worked 7 days a week, including late nights, for 1 year and 5 weeks straight, producing every single creature effect, with the exception of a dog. According to a making of documentary, the then 22-year-old's schedule was so punishing and his attention to detail was so obsessive that after the filming was finished, he was hospitalized with exhaustion and pneumonia. It's also interesting to note that his work was criticized for being too gruesome and distracting for the themes of the film. Although ultimately, they said that his work elevated the film, which it absolutely does.
But it was.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for Rob Bottin, but I mean, The Thing is like held up as the prime example on like a masterpiece of practical effects. I mean, you look at that movie today. I mean, I won't go so far into hyperbole and say that you could sit anyone down and show them that film and they would be impressed, because people, I'm sure there are people out there who would say that it looks fake. But it doesn't necessarily have to look real, it just needs to look good, and those effects, they look fantastic. And I'd argue they look real. But the thing is the class example on how well practical effects can elevate a movie. And Rob Bottin's work was insane. And to think, the irony that when they finally decided to make a sequel years later, it was supposed to be a prequel.
Okay.
It was supposed to take place on the Norwegian base. And they really, I don't remember when it came out, could have been around 2011, The Thing. And they had built all these practical effects because there was not a big backlash, but there was a backlash from fans when they were remaking it.
Mm-hmm.
That, oh, you're not going to use practical effects, you're going to go the way of CGI. And they said, no, we're making practical effects, we're going to do this the proper way. And then the studio saw the practical effects, they ordered them to, no, paint over it with CGI. So all the physical effects that they had created, they kind of just jettisoned. And then they painted over it with CGI, and it looks awful.
Yeah.
So you look at two movies that are, oh, my math is not good, but like 30 years apart. and the effects in The Thing from 1982 are 1,000 times better than any of the crap in the new one.
So here is where we get into the real, wet, chunky, bloody meat of the episode. I wanted to hear Bendik's opinion on the use of gore in horror films. Whether it is, in fact, a service to the story that utilizing these blood, guts, body trauma, special effects, practical effects to disfigure body parts should be part and parcel of any horror film. If someone dies, blood will be spilled. Or whether it just falls into this torture porn category where it serves no purpose and it's just gratuitous, bloody murder that is just for the enjoyment of sick sickos.
Well, it kind of depends on which, what type of impact you want it to have, but it certainly has an impact on the audience either way. Violence in cinema can be multiple things. It can be fun. It can be the fun, cathartic violence of, something like a Tarantino movie, like Django Unchained or any of his movies. You have that kind of fun, over-the-top, gory violence. Or indeed in a slasher movie. I mean, you watch a slasher movie for the creative kills. You know, The Burning has that famous raft sequence where the killer chops up a bunch of students in a boat. Okay. And it's just insane. Blood flying everywhere, fingers, body parts. And that can be fun. You watch these things, some people might call you sick for thinking that's fun, but it's supposed to be fun. That's the reason you go to these slasher movies. But violence can also function as something to horrify you, to disturb you, like the ending to Taxi Driver, for instance, where Scorsese is quoted as saying, like, he wanted you to kind of feel for Travis Bickle, Robert De Niro's character, and he wanted you to root for him to go on this rampage to save Jodie Foster's character. But then when he actually does it, that's when he wants you to kind of stop and as you see the carnage and the bloodbath, you're gonna kind of stop and think that, oh shit, I did not want this. This is horrifying. But either way, gore has a function to elicit a response from you. It doesn't matter which context, fun or horrifying. The important thing is that it actually gives a reaction in you. And I think CGI gore doesn't even come close to give you that reaction because it looks so fake. And these days, a lot of movies use fake, like CGI blood. And I know it's nitpicky and probably people are going to hear and think, oh, what a freak Bendik is. Why does he care about the blood squirting in the scenes if it looked fake or not? But it truly takes me out of the film. And even, I mentioned Taxi Driver. Martin Scorsese used to be an expert at movie violence. Mm-hmm. But he has become lazy. He just wants to use CGI blood in his movies these days. I mean, The Irishman. I like The Irishman, but it's full of horrible CGI blood and horrible aging, de-aging, but that's another thing. And if you're making an action movie, it's easy to just decide that, okay, we'll add the blood in later, in post-production. Because if you decide to go for PG-13, you can just simply don't put it in. Or you can put in minimal amounts. And it's easier, like, I'm using Scorsese again, but like he likes to do these long takes. And in The Irishman, there's certainly a lot of long takes where characters walk and talk, and then all of a sudden one of them gets gunned down. It's obviously a lot easier to do that with CGI blood. Yeah. Because you don't have to use squibs, you don't have to use practical effects, you can do it all in one take and then just add it in. So I understand why directors do it, but it looks, it doesn't look good. It's so visceral cinema, and when you watch a slasher movie, you want that response. You want the killing is at like the end of a long scene where they kind of been building up to it. So you want the release or the climax of the scene to be good, and you don't get there with CGI. I don't think.
Yeah. Okay.
And even in other movies, like when the violence is supposed to hit you hard and it's supposed to make you feel bad. If Taxi Driver, the ending to Taxi Driver was full of CGI blood, it would look pretty bad. If Saving Private Ryan was full of just CGI. It wouldn't look as good. It wouldn't feel as real, and even Gaspar Noé in Irreversible, which is a horrifying film. It's a great film, but it's horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a scene at the start where Vincent Cassel's character is beating to death a guy with a fire extinguisher. And I think that's done in like a combination of practical effects and then CGI, because it starts at practical effects and then it gradually slides over into CGI. And once it slides, it's one of the most nasty visuals I've ever seen. It horrified me. It like shook me to my core. I think, oh wow, this is nasty. I don't want to see this. But then it went too far and it went into CGI territory right at the end, and it just took me out of it again. It's okay, yeah, it's CGI. It doesn't feel real anymore. Why should I feel bad about this?
Well, I was gonna just follow up with what you were saying with that like, I feel like the point of people watching these films is that they want some sort of visceral reaction. And I wanted to just briefly, just before we finish, get into the torture porn debate, because that's something that I think that a lot of maybe non-horror fans can kind of have a viewpoint, because it definitely is a thing that there are just these films that are just people dying in elaborate creative ways, like the Saw, what the Saw franchise turned into, and Final Destination, for example. But I just wanted to read you this quote from Eli Roth from Hostel fame. Yeah, I really like those films, I have to say. The third one is a flop, but the second one was great. I'm just gonna put it out there.
I want to watch the second one. I've watched the first one, rewatched the first one, and it's not that bad.
Yeah,
I remembered it as worse than it was.
So he was asked, are torture porn films popular because audiences have become more sadistic? And he said, quote, "The truth of the matter is, at times of terror, people want to be terrified, but in a safe environment, with all the things going on in the world, people want to scream."
You want to... there was... For a while, I was also into the Saw movies, even though I do think that they derailed towards the latter half.
Yeah.
But, we're not kidding anybody. We went to Saw to watch as gory murders as possible.
Yeah.
You want that reaction. You want to feel like, oh, this looks painful. It's a response. It's cinema reaching out of the screen and grabbing you and making you feel something, and it's fun. That's cinema violence has a unique ability to do that, I think, and if done well, it can be really good. And but there is something to be said, like, for torture porn. It's not really my favorite of horror genres. It depends on how it's done, but there was a while where there was like a big wave of torture porn, and then there was a subgenre of horror in France that grew out in like the mid 2000s, called French. It was dubbed New French Extremity, which was a bunch of French horror films where they just took it really far for some reason and produced some truly graphic horror movies. I didn't think they had it in them. I mean, at that time when those movies were coming out, I watched a lot of like Japanese horror, like Audition and stuff, and I knew that those guys knew how to push the envelope. I did not think the French were able to, but man, they did. One of the movies that came out of this period was a movie called Martyrs, directed by Pascal Laugier, I think his name is. And this movie, it is a horror movie. It is about a girl fleeing from captivity. She's been captured for a long time. She goes back to take revenge on the people who captured her. And I'm not going to spoil it any more than that. But the first half is more or less a basic graphic horror film. Then the second half goes into more torture porn territory. But what it almost functions at is a critique of torture porn. It's like the director wants to kind of punish the viewer and say, oh, you wanted torture, did you? You wanted suffering? You like to go to cinema for suffering? Here you go. And then the last act, there is so much abuse and so much depravity that you, as a viewer, feel like you are going through the same thing. And it's one of the few movies that I can't sit through more than. I've seen it a few times, but it is truly one of those experiences that's so exhausting that at the end you feel like you've been going through the same thing as the character in the scene. You just want it to be over. You want just, oh, please don't show me any more violence. I can't handle anymore.
Wow. I think that there's just like a morbid fascination that I feel like every person has. It's sort of evolved now with the whole true crime thing. Is that, you may not be watching someone be chopped into a million tiny pieces, but you're listening to someone describe that happen. So
Exactly.
I don't think that it stems too far from what that is. It's just like a fascination with seeing people die. I think that we all kind of want to see, but we don't want to see. And
We like to feel excited. We like to get that rush of endorphins, and movie violence can certainly do that. I mean, it can be so not just in slasher movies, but in any type of like revenge movie. Like there's a movie called Rolling Thunder, which I'm sure not many people have seen. Written by Paul Schrader, came out in the 70s, and that whole film is just the main character at the start. He gets his family is killed, and he gets his hand chopped off in a grinder, in a kitchen grinder, and he's a Vietnam vet, and then at the end he wants to take revenge. The whole movie is just a build up to that spectacular bloody climax at the end, and when that happens, you almost cheer in your seats. And that's true for almost any of these revenge movies. Not all people like it, but when a movie kind of just builds and builds and builds and then releases all the tension in a bloody carnage of a climax, it's so much fun. It makes you feel so alive. I want to even though this movie, certainly not all people like this one, but Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the end when Brad Pitt kills all those Manson people, it made me cheer in my seat. I was just, yeah, go, and I laughed. I had so much fun, and I went back the next day with my friends to watch it again.
Wow.
And I was so much looking forward to that scene, because it just, I don't know, it elicits something in me. I don't want to go out and hurt people in real life, but I love watching it in cinema.
Yeah. That sort of overjoyed feeling is how I felt at the end of Midsommar.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, I was so... And I felt like something is real wrong with me. When the way that I was smiling at the end of that film, while my friends were sitting there like horrified, but I was like, good for her, I would do the same.
But did you watch the director's cut, or did you watch the theatrical cut?
The theatrical cut, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I was a little bit more ambivalent in the theatrical cut. I was like,
oh really?
Oh wow, okay, we're going the route of the Wicker Man. Okay, yeah. Except not as horrifying as the Wicker Man, but still, I was like a bit more ambivalent, and more like, oh, that's kind of overkill. I'm not sure he deserves that. But in the director's cut, it's made much more clear that the person we're talking about is an asshole.
Yeah.
And kind of deserve what happens.
I guess I didn't need as much convincing.
But you did, since we're talking about movie violence kind of making you feel giddy. I remember you told me that you loved Terrifier 2.
I did love Terrifier 2.
And Terrifier 2 is full of depraved violence, but it also, the director of that film is a practical effects creator, and he made the effects.
And that is such a great example of good practical effects.
It is.
Yeah.
And the kills are so cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 2.5-hour film, and the acting is not that great, except for the guy who plays the clown.
Yeah.
He's great. But man, every single time someone was killed in that movie, I was just, yes, give it to me, show me what you got. And he always just pushes it further and further. He pushes it so far that it becomes funny. But it's so cool, and that's a recent example on how movie violence can make you feel. And another example, but then we have to kind of go back a few years, is of course Peter Jackson's famous movie Brain Dead, also known as Dead Alive.
Mm-hmm.
which has so much gore in it that you don't know how, not only gore but just disgusting things. Like it's a properly disgusting movie, and you could very well, like, I think I showed it to my brother once and he almost puked. But it is supposed to be funny, and it is one of those movies that kind of make you feel queasy in a good way.
Yeah.
With it, and it's all practical, of course. It is. Peter Jackson was a special effects wizard, and the effects on that film is just incredible. And it's so, it has that famous scene where he chops up zombies with a lawnmower, which has kind of been shown over and over again.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good example of another example on how feelings that supposed to make you feel kind of icky, because Terrifier 2 is also, it's, the violence is gruesome.
It is.
And people could easily watch that and just feel ugh,
Yeah.
and queasy, but it's in a good way.
Yeah.
You're disgusted in a good way. And that is fun.
Yeah. Thank you very much for talking to me about some gross stuff. I wouldn't want to talk to anyone else about disgusting horror stuff. You're definitely a good authority on that, I think.
Thank you for letting me talk about disgusting horror, because this has been the only time where I've been allowed to talk uninterrupted about movie gore without have people looking at me like I'm some sort of escaped lunatic.
Well, that's that. Another excellent episode. Thank you again to Bendik for joining to talk about some super gross, gory stuff and just give great insight into something I love talking about and I don't get to talk about enough, which is horror. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. Next week we are talking about the documentary Tickled. So there's going to be some uncomfortableness for sure, but we're going to get a little bit true crimey, a little bit gross again. So definitely check that out. But this has been The Real Thing. Thank you so much for listening. Catch you next time. Goodbye. This has been a Bergen Film Club production. Our music is by Wise John. Check them out on Instagram at WISEJohnOfficial. Our logo is by Pia Sofia Brentersen. This episode was produced, mixed and engineered by Joel Lawrence. Our researchers are Inke Shilpkai-Ben and Mamina Nazmajid. Want to talk to us about films? Then please send us an email at podcast@bergenfilmclub.com. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter at TheRealThingPod. Check us out on Letterboxd at BFK The Real Thing. Thank you and goodbye. Listen, follow, leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts.